everybody. Welcome back. Today we're looking at Chapter 18, Section 4, Part 1, the end of Reconstruction. I split this discussion into two different lessons because today we're going to look more at the political side of things and the political things that happened that brought an end to Reconstruction and how the South grew in the years following Reconstruction. In our next and what will be our final video for this chapter, we'll look at how the end of Reconstruction affected the people in the South. So today we'll look more at the political side of things, and then tomorrow we'll look at the social side of things. And there are audio recordings for today, so if you would prefer to use one of those, you can just click below the pictures of James Duke, and that will go through each section of today's audio recording. But if not, let's continue and look at our key terms for today. And we really only have two key terms for today. That would be the Amnesty Act of 1872 and this term, quote, New South. And we'll look at that in the second half of our discussion today. So, the Amnesty Act of 1872 and the New South. Now, before, during, and then following the Civil War, and specifically during Reconstruction, Republicans had been in full control of the legislative and executive branches of government, especially during and following the Civil War. Now, on one hand, some people believed that this was good for the nation because during the time of Reconstruction, many believed that the South needed to be punished for the Civil War. But this was all about to come to an end with two things: the election of 1876 and more specifically the Compromise of 1877. So I want to watch this first video because it'll kind of give an idea of where we're going with today's discussion, and then we will pick up with the rest of our discussion after this first video, the Compromise of 1877.
The Compromise of 1877. The year 1876 was an election year. Democrat Samuel Tilden and the Republican challenger, Rutherford B. Hayes, were the presidential candidates. 3 years earlier, in 1873, the Panic of 1873, a serious depression, had hit the nation. Voters turned against the Republicans, blaming them for the economic downturn. And in the congressional elections of 1874, Democrats won dozens of seats in the House, giving them a congressional majority. A similar scenario played out in the presidential race of 1876. Prior to this time in American history, there had never been a really close electoral college vote. But this year, it was different.
What happens in 1876 is that the election is very close. In fact, the vote is so close that the change of just a few electors in just a few states would throw the election one way or the other.
Samuel Tilden won the popular vote, but Rutherford B. Hayes won the more important electoral college vote, although by only one vote.
The Democrats thought it was pretty clear that they had won the election, but the Republicans became convinced, actually not on election night, but increasingly in the next few days, that it wasn't clear that a fair election had been held in Louisiana or in Florida especially. And indeed, there were still federal troops in Louisiana, still somewhat extensively. And Florida was just in the process of transition from Republican to Democratic control.
The parallels to the Bush-Gore presidential election of the year 2000 are fascinating.
Florida's involvement is kind of ironic because the next great crisis of the Electoral College in the year 2000 involves the state of Florida and involves a sort of unnerving set of parallels in which the Secretary of State is in one party, the legislature's in the hand of the other party, and the Attorney General is in the different hands than the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General and the Secretary of State are on opposite sides. And it's exactly replicated in the year 2000.
To defuse the crisis, the Republicans made a deal with the Democrats called the Compromise of 1877.
And the compromise is to set up a special electoral commission to hear evidence and determine the electoral votes.
There's a bit of controversy on how the matter was settled.
Now, historians will say the real action happened outside of the commission, that in fact a deal was cut to allow the Republican candidate to be elected, provided that what the Democrats most wanted was achieved, namely that Reconstruction was ended, that federal troops would be removed from the southern states. Modern historians have challenged that notion of a deal cut outside, if only because by 1876 there were relatively few federal troops still in the South. I mean, effectively, they controlled a few blocks in New Orleans by March of 1877, or late February 1877, when the election is getting determined. So it's not clear that anything could have been done to stop the end of military Reconstruction in the South.
In any case, federal troops were removed from the southern states, and the Reconstruction governments promptly weakened and fell. The South was now returned to its pre-Reconstruction status, and as a result, the suffering of Southern African Americans was far from over. To make matters worse, in 1883, the United States Supreme Court declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional.
The act seems straightforward enough, but in 1883 the Supreme Court struck it. They struck particularly the enforcement provision, arguing that the 14th Amendment only encompassed public discrimination, not private. In other words, only those things that were involved with the state, which they call state action.
This decision, in essence, made segregation legal. The era of Jim Crow in the South had begun. The goal of white supremacists was to keep African Americans oppressed, uneducated, impoverished, and segregated from white society.
The end of Reconstruction. Well, by the 1870s, many of the Northerners were really just tired of Reconstruction and tired of trying to reconstruct the South. They believed it was time for the South to get back on its own feet and take care of things for itself. Now, Southerners had been upset this whole time. They'd been upset at being under Republican governments, and honestly, a lot of people in the North were sick of trying to, quote, reform the South. So even if African Americans lost some of these rights that they had just gained, the Reconstruction era was really about to come to an end. And it really was the radical Republicans that lost a lot of their support because there had been reports of corruption. President Grant, while he was a war hero, he had given a lot of government jobs to a lot of his friends, and some had used these jobs to steal large sums of money from the government. And even though Grant won re-election in 1872, by then most Northerners had really given up on radical Reconstruction and the Republican Party as a whole. And with the passage of the Amnesty Act of 1872, nearly all white Southerners were once again able to vote. And the large majority of them voted Democrat, so between losing those votes and the continuing violence towards African Americans that kept a lot of them from the polls, from the voting booths, by 1876, only 3 southern states were still under Republican control. So Reconstruction was really on the decline, but it officially came to an end with the election of 1876. The Democratic candidate was Samuel Tilden of New York, and the Republican candidate was Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. Now, as we can see from this chart, Tilden won the popular vote, but was one vote shy of the needed electoral votes to win. He had 184, but he needed 185. So the outcome of the election would depend on the 20 disputed electoral votes, and all but one of those votes came from Republican-controlled states. So to solve the issue of who would win the disputed election of 1876, Congress set up a commission to decide the outcome. And since the commission was mostly made up by Republicans, those votes were given to Rutherford B. Hayes. Democrats continued to argue the decision of the commission, but Hayes secretly agreed to end Reconstruction. So, soon after being sworn in as the 19th President of the United States, all federal troops were removed from the remaining southern states. And the South remained a stronghold for the Democratic Party for the next almost 100 years, and many of the rights that African Americans had gained during Reconstruction sadly were lost. And in our next section, we're going to look at the impact that the end of Reconstruction had on the African American population in the South.
During the Grant administration, the North becomes increasingly preoccupied with its own political and economic problems, and interest in Reconstruction fades. In fact, by the time Grant leaves office, Democrats have redeemed 7 of the 11 former Confederate states. It is a setting in which secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan can use intimidation and violence to undermine the gains that had been made.
The defenders of the Ku Klux Klan argue that the South had devolved into utter chaos, that African Americans were threatening whites' life and liberty, and that there was no one to impose order because the military governments were committed to the interest of African Americans, and so white Southerners took it upon themselves to create an organization to bring order to the South. Well, the practical reality was the Ku Klux Klan was a means of, yes, bringing order, but on the white man's terms. Simply put, the Ku Klux Klan was a terrorist organization used to reestablish white supremacy.
The Republican Congress tries to turn back this new wave of white repression. In 1870 and 1871, they passed 2 enforcement acts that allow the federal government to confront Klan efforts to restrict the vote. This is a first. Never before has government claimed the power to prosecute individual crimes under federal law.
I think it is fair to say that in 1870, 1871, there was an exertion of federal authority and an expansion of black political participation in a way that changed the direction of Reconstruction for a period of time. But by 1874, 75, 76, for a host of reasons, the national commitment to Reconstruction was waning, and white Southerners reverted to using violence and intimidation again, without the sort of umbrella of the Ku Klux Klan.
The Northern Democratic Party all along said Reconstruction is wrong. They sympathized with their Southern Democratic brethren that you have an oppressive government in Washington. So what you have in this period of the 1870s is a struggle within the Republican Party between people who said the federal government has a responsibility to try to protect these people's rights, that is the former slaves' rights, particularly the right to vote, to participate in the polity, and to do what it takes for that to happen. When a growing number of people in the Republican Party said, no, the cost is too high, that these are not really good citizens, and so it's better to have the property classes in the South retake control.
Grant plans to run for another term in 1876, but Republican leaders, shaken by Democratic gains, resist. On Election Day, his name is not on the ballot.
Samuel Tilden was the Democratic candidate for president. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate for president. When the votes were counted, Hayes won most of the northern states and lost the two important states of New York and Indiana. Tilden won most of the southern states, and three states in the South were undecided, or disputed, shall we say: Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. The old interpretation was that representatives of Southern Democrats met with Hayes representatives in Washington and made a deal.
A deal that has Hayes removing all remaining troops from the South in exchange for support of his presidency. But not everyone agrees with this interpretation.
A half century ago, one of our most distinguished historians, C. Van Woodward, raised the question, well, Tilden would have removed the troops. That doesn't make any sense. Why would they give in to Hayes on that point? And so Woodward, in his interpretation, entered this into the mix as well, that Hayes' representatives said, well, Hayes would support internal improvements for the South, and the deal was struck.
And the last thing that I want to look at today is the impact that the end of Reconstruction had on the South, and this term, quote, New South. So traditionally, the North and the South were different in their economies. The North had been a industrial economy, and the South had been more of an agricultural economy. But during and following Reconstruction, the South tried to revitalize its economy and bring in more industry and bring in more industrial centers. For instance, by 1880, cotton production was right back to the level it was in 1860, and a new generation of leaders tried to expand the economy into other industries. If you remember all the way back into our discussions from chapters 14, 15, and 16, the industrial centers that were there in the South tended to deal mainly with promoting agricultural products. Well, this New South would use its own natural resources to build its own industries to try and not depend so heavily on the industrial centers of the North. So to give us a little bit of background, in the year 1880, the entire South produced fewer finished textiles than the state of Massachusetts. So just the state of Massachusetts produced more finished textiles than the entire South combined. But during Reconstruction and following it, communities started building mills to try and process cotton into cloth. And the tobacco industry also grew, and at one point, this man, Mr. James Duke of North Carolina, was in control of 90% of the nation's tobacco industry. And agriculture also remained a very large part of the Southern economy, but you can see now that it was becoming more industrialized. It wasn't so heavily dependent on agriculture. It's branching out into other industrialized areas. Expanding outward from agriculture, some new industries were starting to pop up around the South. Large deposits of oil, coal, and iron ore helped Alabama to become an important center of the steel industry, while other states produced copper, granite, oil, and marble. Lumber and hardwood became increasingly important to Southern industries during this time in attempts to help balance the economy of the South. And the economy did become more balanced, but it really still could not match the North or the West for its rapid growth.
Southern industry does expand in the years that follow.
In an effort to diversify the economy, not just be dependent on one crop, cotton, which was very problematical after the war, but expand that. Build a textile industry so you don't send the cotton up north.
The steel industry in Alabama, textiles in the Carolinas, those new jobs that provide an alternative to landowner labor are restricted to whites. Those new economic opportunities are for white people.
Some blacks, however, do manage to acquire property, establish small businesses, and enter professions. The key is education. And for a time, the major spokesman for the importance of education for his race is Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama.
Booker T. Washington's an enormously important figure, both for what he actually did and what he represented. It is perhaps the most extraordinary of all the American rags to riches stories. So, symbolically, he was a testament to what African Americans could do in freedom. At the same time, he built up Tuskegee as an entirely black-run institution with black faculty, black students, teaching subjects relevant to African Americans at a time when, of course, blacks could not go, at least in the South, to white institutions. And he finally articulated a vision of how it was that blacks were going to survive in an era of white supremacy. The compromises, as he saw it, was that African Americans would strive for a degree of economic autonomy, and once they had that, then white America would have to deal with them from a position of power as opposed to a position of weakness. It's not that he believed that African Americans should completely sacrifice political rights, equality, but that the first priority was that economic institutional foundation. Others, Ida Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, argued that you couldn't separate out black aspirations. So he was being criticized from both sides.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, there's not a written assignment associated with this lesson, but I want you to review the section in your textbook and in preparation for the upcoming text. And if you have not done so already, go back and review the key terms from this section to make sure you can identify each one and its importance. Like I said, in our next lesson, we're going to look at some of the social effects of Reconstruction, and specifically some of the negative effects of Reconstruction, as opposed to some of the positive impacts we looked at today, like the response to corruption in the federal government, unification of the nation, the growth of industry in the New South. And our final lesson for Chapter 18 will focus on the people most affected by the end of Reconstruction, freedmen. All right. Well, with that in mind, I want you to go ahead and prepare for tomorrow's lesson. And if you don't have any questions, let's continue on. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. And if you do have questions, you know where to find me.